However, if you are doing it only as a tick box exercise, you need to appreciate and understand and accept that you are covering maybe 30 to 40, maybe 50% of your requirements. So we do really need to understand the other 50% or 60% of the kind of shadow that exists in the realm of our organization, and then focus on that.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for joining us on today's episode. As well as an expert with a spirit level, before we jump onto this episode, can you tell us a bit about yourself? What's your daily job, mate?
Hey, James. Thank you for having me on, first and foremost. Yes, spirit level did come out moments ago, but I think I had to quickly make sure everything was looking perfect for you. So we are in a good level with that perspective.
Appreciate it.
It's a bit about me. Obviously, Michael Dybek, we know each other, but for anyone watching, Michael Dybek, it's awesome to be here. I work as a senior solutions consultant specializing in identity and access management, but have experiences across the entire cybersecurity domains. So from networking all the way through to infrastructure, engineering, and so on and so forth. So I've been in IT for a long time, professionally speaking, coming up to a decade, and in a previous life, academically as well.
No, I appreciate it, mate. And this was really interesting, actually, the way this kind of episode came about, right? Like you said, we've known each other now for a few years now, just chewing the fat. And we were talking about, just for the listeners, we were talking about what we've seen in the cybersecurity landscape over the past few years, how various things have evolved, how use cases can be tackled with, multiple ways, multiple technologies. We started to come on to, I think, Mike, you talking about, the old approach was everything can be done through network security, right? And network security definitely has its place, absolutely. But as over the past few years, we have this evolution of IAM and different use cases, right? It's network security and IAM tools can solve the same use cases, and sometimes it's pretty hard for our listeners to determine which technology route is the best, right? So I don't know if you can just sort of share your thoughts on that, like what we discussed a couple of days ago.
Sure, absolutely, and it's a phenomenal point because it's so true. And even as we look pre-pandemic, so 2019, 2018, network security was still very much the, I would say, go-to when we look at the marketplace. As a company, when we are looking to procure a particular solution to defend against the attackers of the world and secure our infrastructure, we would still be looking at our immediate perimeter. With everyone going into the office, it was very much Monday to Friday. We have most people on site, and that's where we can really bring the most value and protect our premises. Things have changed slightly since 2020, as we very well know. We are no longer office bound, at least less than 50% of the time. We are at home, so we need to think about other means of securing our access, our authorizations, as well as our network, of course. So there is definitely a shift in the mindset that is taking place slowly but surely, in that we need to still focus on networking, securing the perimeters not necessarily via VPNing, but securing our DMZ, securing the private ingress and egress networking that goes in and out. And we can then tie that into protecting our identities, our users that are accessing the resources that we as a company make available to them, of course. So irregardless of where our employees are, where we work from, we can work from the UK today or maybe from Portugal tomorrow. Irregardless of that location, we are secure in the way we can access those resources.
Fair enough. Do you think, just out of curiosity there, you mentioned, pre-pandemic, obviously everybody had to adjust, and everyone's heard this sort of talk before, right? Everyone had to adjust very quickly, get it done as long as you were working. What I've definitely seen happening more is there's now more, positions out there that start to push that hybrid, right? You still have to come back to the office. You have to come back into the office. Now, there's many different reasons for that, right? Like, let's not, don't need to go kind of down that rabbit hole, but I think it's quite interesting because in the pandemic, right, you're talking about identity as the new perimeter there, yeah. But as we start to kind of come back on that into more this hybrid model where companies are asking to come back in, it's very easy, I guess, for companies to, default back to old ways, right? Let's just solve everything through network security.
Very well said. And I think we do still see that mentality coming slowly back. And we need to really, as as someone in my position as a solutions architect in the field, it is about evangelizing the less educated people in the industry, the business owners that may not have the right influence, the technical influence, so that there is a good understanding of what needs to be done in order for us to be secure. And sure, network security is absolutely a safe buy from a procurement perspective. And an old saying rings a bell: you never get fired for buying X. I'm not going to name any particular vendors here. But if we look at my former employer or any of the competition that was and still is in the industry, that does have an element of truth in it. Sure, you won't get fired for choosing one of these solutions. However, if you are doing it only as a tick box exercise, you need to appreciate and understand and accept that you are covering maybe 30 to 40, maybe 50% of your requirements. So we do really need to understand the other 50% or 60% of the kind of shadow that exists in the realm of our organization, and then focus on that.
Yeah, and you can't touch on a point that I talk about with people a lot, right? It's how do you quantify the investments in cybersecurity to the board, to non-techies, right? How do you take that as, even the head of engineering, right? Head of infosec, head of infrastructure, right? You see these problems, and you need to build a case and start to go up the chain on that. Like you said, it's very easy just to fall into the default and just go, I'll just buy this for the tick box. But unless you've done a proper assessment, right? Like, you have absolutely no idea if you're getting 20, 30, 50% coverage. And then all that's going to happen is, we don't wish this upon anybody, but if an event were to happen, right, the expectation that the business has is, well, that solution was supposed to do it. Oh, no, it didn't. Well, why didn't it? Was it the technology's fault, or was it the fact that the assessment in leading up, to taking that viewpoint of everything can be done through, just network security or just IAM focuses, right? It just wasn't taken into account, or was it?
Absolutely not. And it's a very interesting point, because we can look at it from various angles. And at the end of the day, I believe, in my opinion, it's a domino effect. So as long as we have a robust workforce full of well-trained people, and I'm not talking about having everyone being a specialist, because that's just unrealistic. Of course, we do hire the best talent for the technical teams as possible, wherever possible. And as long as those individuals are well enabled technically from an industry perspective, they will be then influence internal decision makers about the X's and the Y's and the Z's that are all coming together for a, lack of a better phrase, a zero trust model. That's a whole conversation aside, of course, but we do need to understand that networking is one thing, identity is another thing, encryption is another. Cybersecurity has 8 domains or subdomains at the end of the day, right? So we need to focus on each and every one of those steps and decide, okay, well, if we are looking on the identity and access management perspective, just for the sake of the argument here, but we need to understand which subdomain of identity it is. Are we focusing on the internal identities, so the workforce? Are we focusing on customers or consumers of our service, which is typically SIAM solutions in the market? Mm-hmm. Are we talking about governance or GRC requirements? And IGA then comes into the picture, of course, quite neatly. Are we focusing on PAM requirements, right? So there are a lot of hoops that we would need to jump through in order to have that understanding. But as people get more technically enabled, we are then able to sit down with them and have a holistic plan in front of us. So we start with blank canvas and draw up the requirements on paper, and then have a good understanding of what actually is priority number 1, 2, and 3. And based on that risk, we then try to secure it.
Okay, so do you have any examples? Whether it be, real customers or hypotheticals, right? Let's just, you can make it as wild as you'd like. But let's talk about that situation, right? You've sat down in a meeting room at work, you are drawing out your requirements, you're drawing out the risks, okay? And obviously you've got, 8 domains just in IAM, and cybersecurity, has even more. There's obviously a lot of overlap and between capabilities on a said use case, right? So we go back to this network security versus IAM sort of mentality, right? When to choose which one and why. Mm-hmm. Can you give the listeners an example, I guess, of a use case where it could be solved with both technology
I can think of I would say there are definitely some overlaps between those two domains, but they do fundamentally focus on different sectors of your landscape. So it would be very difficult to map out an identity requirement with a NetSec security solution and vice versa. So I would say it is quite risky for me to do that, because I don't want the listeners to actually have a perceived understanding that we can have a hybrid solution for a singular requirement. I do think that it's important to draw a distinction between the two and have both in place wherever possible. So if procurement and budgets allow that for us to be the case, then absolutely we can procure an XDR solution as well as an IGA solution, and then they work in parallel. And then you have two fundamental pillars that are very strong, and you are well prepared to have a healthy cybersecurity posture.
Agreed. But that's not always the case in the real world, right? If you have two technologies that will not solve a single use case, by themselves equally, they will have an overlap, right? So a network security might, cover 20%, and then IAM might cover another 20%, right? So again, if you're a head of information security and you go to the business and say, hi, I want to buy 2 solutions just to solve this particular use case, that's a pretty tough conversation to have, right? And you talk about having to justify it to non-techies to understand that you need effectively defense in depth, right? You need layered security, right? How can someone go about that, I guess, and how do they start to position that?
It's definitely a difficult conversation. CISOs and CEOs definitely have the hardest role, I would say, in the executive suite from a persuasion perspective, because they do need to influence the other stakeholders of having such projects take place, and it can be very, very challenging for them. Having said that, I do believe that if we start to map out where most attacks are likely to take place, so if we follow the OWASP top 10, for example, if we follow any other recent cyber attack in the past decade and actually look how those attacks came to be. For example, in the past 5 years, we've seen a lot of attacks via the supply chain, whether it's through the BA's infamous hacks that have happened many, many times, or the Marks and Spencer's attacks as well. There is an element of supply chain lateral movement there as well. So from my perspective, it would be understanding what we value the most, what are the crown jewels, for lack of a better phrase, and securing it from that perspective. I would say more objectively and more holistically, I would always start with identity, because we need to protect access to a particular resource, system, or application first. Mm-hmm. And then if budgets allow it, if we have the required tick boxes to tick, then we can start funneling down internally. But I would never do it from the other side of the spectrum, having an internal security posture healthy, and then nothing on the outside. Because as you can have a very robust workforce security posture in place, but if everything outside is vulnerable, then we can actually gain access quite easily. So it's a tug of war having to do the balancing, but I think having both in place is crucial. And it's oftentimes those situations that save us.
Okay. When you're saying, you've mentioned it a few times on today's episode, the securing identity, right? And I understand that is a loaded question. I'm sure you guess what's coming up, right? But at what point do you define identity as secure, right? Because let's be brutally honest, it's never ending. You can go all the way down the rabbit hole when it comes to IAM policies. And I think that's one of the reasons why people do struggle with IAM as well, right? It's, you look at one thing, you think, well, there's some low hanging fruit, there's a quick win. But then you realize once you've got that one, oh, there's another element, there's another one. It's kind of like, it is never ending. Yeah. So, from a consultancy perspective, right, which I know, you have quite a bit of experience on that as well. Like, at what point does an individual go, right, what is a realistic quick win here? And at what point do I need to take the foot off the gas a little bit? Because ultimately IAM cannot consume your attention and focuses full time in a business, right? That's not realistic.
No, absolutely. And this is a phenomenal point, because in my experiences in network security, you are very easily able to judge when a project is completed, right? When your technical security requirements have been fulfilled, right? You have a technical monitoring solution, or you sniff packets, and then you're able to actually detect what's happening within a particular tunnel, for lack of a better phrase, right? In identity, as you've mentioned, it's completely different, and we often have this conversation: what does good look like? We need to have an ecosystem for identities to be secure, so that we as IT help desk or as the business no longer need to worry about them. So things like creating self-service workflows for them to be able to manage it themselves, whether it's authorizations or authentication tokens, they can do that themselves. If they lose a token, I mean, for example, here I've got a token as an example, a FIDO token from Thales, that we can use to authenticate ourselves with 3FA if we think about it, something you have, something you know, and something you are, if it's a biometric one, of course. And if we lose that as a user, we need a failover to access the system without, ideally, bothering the business, because that is then wasted resources, wasted time, and effectively lost capital for the business. So, in my opinion, to answer your question, a good enough identity security posture looks at the following: ideally, reducing the password utilization in the workflow, so ditching passwords wherever possible, having at least 2 or 3 authenticators so that the identity is never locked out. And those authenticators have to match the risk classification of the identity. So if I'm an administrator, my authenticators should be different from that of an individual in finance, for example, or in manufacturing, or so on and so forth. And finally, we need to look at authorizations. So what is my role and what am I entitled to do? With adequate access, reviews, recertification campaigns, and making sure at every single step of the joining with a leader process that we have segregation of duties in place at all times. And I think that would be a very, very North Star project, let's say. Again, for lack of a better phrase, right? We would be looking at a completely secure infrastructure or landscape.
So I guess, what do you see as the gaps at the moment in terms of getting to that step one, right? Because that step one, effectively, it's MFA, as you said, it is protecting the perimeter at its purest, right? Identity of the perimeter in terms of MFA. But let's be honest, that's not always achievable. There are some quirky use cases, right?
Absolutely.
And if we think about the vast majority of businesses, you'll default to what you already have in the stack, right? Entra, things like that. Some do utilize, third-party solutions out there.
Homegrown solutions.
But there's always gaps, right? But the point is, though, is that why is that going to be not watertight, right? If that's watertight, the rest of it is very policy and workflow and more about efficiency. Step one, as you called it out, is actually full almost protection from external, right? So in your experience, where did the gaps come from?
I would say the gaps, there are many gaps we can identify initially when scoping out a particular business. And it depends vertical to vertical, right? There always will be slightly different gaps here and there. But the overlapping ones, I would say, are lack of training, internal training.
Yeah.
Lack of understanding what the real assets are within the business. So having a good understanding what is the most valuable thing to us in our organization is absolutely key, whether it's our data, whether it's any proprietary information that we have, right? So it could be intellectual property of some sort. It can be, again, an algorithm. So that would be an example of an IP. So once we have an understanding of what the asset is, we are then able to map or reverse engineer the journey from there and fill those gaps. So we can also look at it from, okay, well, if we don't have an adequately trained workforce in order to identify these things, let's use a third party to help us do this, right? Let's actually enable ourselves from a third party. So this can be a third party consulting firm. It can be leveraged from the channel if we're a vendor and we actually work together to understand the greater picture. So there are many ways we can do this, but it always starts with what is the most important thing to us. If it's data, then we need to secure the access to that data. And again, looking at the more holistic picture of cybersecurity, sure, we can do it from the identity perspective, i.e. the access, but also the data itself, the data in motion, at rest, and in use. So encryption then comes into the picture as well. So yet another subdomain of cybersecurity. So we always need to have a good grasp of what's the most important, and then we can reverse engineer from there.
Okay. It's very interesting you mentioned the use of third parties, though. So consultants,
Auditors.
resellers, auditors, things like that. And yeah, because ultimately what you're suggesting there is, right, leverage knowledge that's already there, right? Because it's a behemoth, right? Like whether it's network security, whether it's IAM, whether it's encryption, whether it's whatever, like, and there's only so many, and this is all on top of your day job, right? Whilst servicing tickets, whilst putting out fires, which get rid of tech debt, which trying to drive innovation to make the business grow, etc. So I guess two parts to this question coming up here. So from a customer's perspective, right, and we'll keep with IAM, right? In respect that IAM is your expertise. What should a customer look for from a partner, right? Whether it be a consultant or a reseller, right? What should they look for? And then equally, how can a partner put them in a position to a best placed position to offer advice around this, these different technologies?
Okay, that's a really good question, and that's a really good point, and it's an important one because over the years I've worked with partners through various, I guess, domains of cybersecurity. So we've touched upon both, and I have been very fortunate to actually have worked with really amazing GSIs, amazing partners, distributors in the industry. But of course, we can always improve things. However, it is not one-sided. It's never one-sided. Just like in a relationship, things are able to be improved from both ends. Of course, unless one party really messes up the situation, then that's a completely different story. But that's an edge case, I would say. Typically, we need to focus on, as a vendor, enabling the partner as often as possible. And from the partner perspective, we need to take that on board, right? So one common mistake I see partners make is treating singular events or enablement sessions, excuse me, as a de facto training session. And while that 1.5 hours may be a great overview of the solution that we are proposing to fix with yourselves, it is never enough for your technical evangelists and engineers to fully grasp and then re-represent on their behalf, right? It's a continued effort that we need to put in play. So having monthly or at least quarterly enablement sessions between the technical teams, in my opinion, is the first priority. Because without that, the buck stops with you, right? You hold all the information. Yes, you've enabled that person once every 6 months, but you're almost rehashing the same information because there is no way that their technical team is able to know all the ins and outs that your solution is able to achieve and the value it's able to bring from very infrequent sessions.
Yeah, you're trying to build intuitiveness from the partner.
Exactly.
No, that's fair. I guess it brings me back to kind of the earlier point in this episode, right? When we were talking about internally, single use case, two different ways of solving it, right? So whether it be network security versus IAM, that it's almost like then, okay, well, I'm going to just let this third party make that decision for me, right? Like that's their job. They need to be enabled by vendors. They need to spend their time with their ear to the ground. They need to understand my business as well, right? I guess equally, when would a customer know if a partner is best positioned to do that, right?
We could look at certifications, perhaps, as one means. So we, as vendors, typically would, in an ideal situation, like to impose different levels of certifications over a specific period of time in order for that partner to be well enabled at all times. And then as the customer, we can take that as a point of reference and say, okay, well, if partner A has the specialist, let's say, for lack of a better example, as the top certifications for a vendor, if they have that live and achieved at all times, that means they need to go through a variety of tests and quizzes and examinations and assessments every 3 months, so once a quarter, in order to get that and obtain it and renew it. If they don't have it, well, then it starts to become a pattern of maybe not resitting the assessments and not being up to date with the solution. So recertifications and just general certification exams, I think, are really a good way to implement from both perspectives, from a vendor as well as from a partner.
Okay. I guess that, so it's part of like a supplier onboarding or if you review market, right, that could be something that could be easily asked, right? Tell us your certification, because I guess it'll give you a bit of an insight actually to the direction of the partner in themselves, right? If they have highest certifications in one particular vendor, expect them to push that vendor, right? So when you're coming back to the whole, you need to make a case to the business about, hey, we might need multiple products to tackle this area that we've highlighted, right? So again, coming to that, back to that defense in depth position, you equally need to find a partner that has got the certifications across the board, right?
That is very true. That is very true.
It's very easier said than done. I would imagine those are somewhat unicorns, but that would be the way that I would at least interpret that, right?
Absolutely. And just to kind of add a little bit to my previous point here as well, and to address what you just said as well, I would say looking at, as a customer, looking at a well-enabled third-party distributor or partner that would then help you with addressing your requirements, it is very good to look at, how many vendors they look after. So if you have, and how many people they have in their workforce looking after that number of vendors as well. So if you have 100 engineers looking after 100 different vendors, we can pretty much make the assumption that, okay, well, they are going to be high level at the very least. They're not going to be specialists in this particular solution or this particular vendor. However, if we have the same 100 engineers looking after 50 solutions, and two people they work in pairs essentially. So we have two specialists working on one vendor and one vendor only. We then know that there is a little bit more specialization in that vendor. However, if we always look one-to-one or even 300 vendors across 50 specialists, then we can probably make the assumption that it's not going to be a very well-enabled organization.
No, that's fair enough. And then out of curiosity, do you think that, does any of this ever come up in your experiences on projects from your consulting days, right? Has this ever come up before when you are submitting the business case, when you are asking for budget, when you are like, you're at the end of the POC, vendors are trying to do a thing, and let's say it's a vendor that goes strictly through the channel, right? Do you find that this is ever brought up? It's not just about the technology, people, process, technology, right? And kind of what we're talking about here is people. It's just people within the reseller, right? Because they will understand our processes, the process of the vendor, and then they can apply the technology better, right? I'm just curious, like, do you ever see this brought up as a topic? It's the technology, we know the technology works, but are we partnering with the right people on this one?
I do see this pretty much every single time I'm involved in a particular project or in a particular organization, because business at the end of the day is done through people, right? And we, I think, as business owners, as consultants, as anyone in the industry, are able to read people quite well. And what I mean by that is, if we are speaking to an expert in a particular domain and they are represented by a channel account manager, for example, from the commercial perspective, we should hopefully be able to quickly decrypt their knowledge or the lack of understanding, or their understanding of a particular topic they're presenting to us. So if there is a lot of questions around a particular functionality or a particular requirement, and there is no immediate response to how to solve that particular challenge, then maybe we should rethink the position we are in here. However, if we are always learning new information and new ideas and new solutions to a particular product and problem, then maybe that person is really well enabled to actually be our advisor and a trusted technical lead as well.
Someone that kind of takes you through things like, a bit of a cheesy phrase, but something like inspiration sessions. It's you could use it like this. There's the very vanilla approach to it, but here you go, I've learned of a different use case, and you could use it like this, ABC, without obviously breaking the tool. But that's kind of what you're after there. Like, people that can just bring you curveballs or insights, right? It's not just at the, everybody does insights now at the industry level, and it's all about stats, but really you kind of want insights from, well, yeah, I'm talking to you about one particular challenge that I've got, but if we go back to, when we talk about IAM, right? It's never ending. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Never ending. So it's, okay, yes, it will solve these use cases. And then once you've done that, you will probably encounter this challenge, or your next iteration would be that, like somebody that helps you understand like how far you can push the boat, really.
Absolutely. Someone who thinks outside the box and is able to be well versed in various technologies, an evangelist, for lack of a better phrase, and someone who really has a good network as well, so that maybe as a procurement team, you're able to do references and such on that particular individual or company as well.
Fair enough. Well, no, Mike, I really appreciate you being on today. Just in case anybody obviously wants to reach out to you, get some advice, how do we tackle this? Where can people best find you?
Thank you very much as well for having me. If you would like to get in contact with myself, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, I suppose, and we can continue the conversation from there. But James, it's been a pleasure. Thank you again for having me on. It's been a really good conversation.
No, appreciate it, mate. And just before you clock off, look, you get to talk with many people, right? Is there anybody else that you think has got interesting points of view, some insights, or generally just a bit of a laugh to have on the show?
I do, and I have spoken briefly with this person before, so hopefully they don't mind being mentioned here. And it is actually a former colleague of mine from a former employer of mine as well, Craig Ramsey, a really, really well-versed expert in IGA, or in the identity security as well. So I think if you manage to get a conversation with him, you'll not only enjoy the conversation, but you'll also bring a lot of value to the listeners as well. So Craig, if you're watching this, hopefully you don't mind being called out and spending some time with James on another episode.
Hopefully not, mate. Well, no, I'll reach out to Craig, see if we can make that happen. But until then, mate, thanks very much for being on the episode. And yeah, we'll hear from you soon.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Bye.
Take care.